Hello everybody and welcome. It is Wednesday, 4 p.m. Central European Time, so it's webinar time. Our webinar sessions center around the topic of populism and is part of the Nova Migra, that is, Norms and Values in European Migration Crisis project funded by the EU. The Nova Migra project tackles a topical issue that has become prominent in recent years in political science: the question of the rise of populism, its connection with migration, and its effects on Western democracies. The accompanying 5-part webinar series covers the relationship of migration and populism from various levels of abstraction. So we'll go from the philosophical to the socio-political approaches. The presentations will be accompanied by slides summarizing the content of the presentation. The webinar, by nature, is an interactive platform, so please feel free to join the discussion through our chat feature. Your questions will be answered and your remarks discussed after the presentation. And if you have missed something or would like to listen to any of the presentations again, we'll be sending the recording of the webinars around soon. So let's get started. We are launching this 5-part webinar series with a presentation entitled Matter over Mind: Populism, an Appeal to Numbers by János Salamon. According to the Socratic tradition, democracy is the rule of quantity over quality, passion over reason, matter over mind. Our presenter will explore the relationship between anti-intellectual, anti-elite populism and democracy. János Salamon is a professor of philosophy at McDaniel College, Budapest, and a former associate professor at Moholy Nagy University of Arts and Design, Budapest. He also taught at various institutions in New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. So please welcome Professor Salamon and enjoy our webinar.
Hello. So as you can see from the title, my talk will be limited to discussing populism. It's a large enough topic in itself, but within this topic, I will concentrate on what philosophy or political philosophy can say about the subject. As you can see from this cartoon, the general perception of populism is that it's a slippery concept, and you can start from this, but I don't think you can get too far from the admission that this is a slippery concept, that political science has a hard time of defining the concept itself. So we are not even going to try to compete with political science, but instead we are going to look at questions which are much simpler, and we are going to raise questions which are much simpler, and we are going to start from concepts which are simpler. As you can tell from the next slide, there are certain concepts which speak for themselves, so to speak. Liberalism, conservatism, populism are concepts like that. On the other hand, the concepts which cause great trouble for political science, left and right, left wing and right wing, are concepts which do not speak for themselves. These are concepts which have an arbitrary origin. I mean, the 1789 French Revolution had an assembly where on the left to the president, people who supported the revolution were sitting, and to the right of the president, people who supported the king. This is completely arbitrary. So analyzing the concept left or right will not lead you very far. On the other hand, analyzing the concept of liberalism, conservatism, or populism will give you some starting points because the words speak for themselves. Liberalism Liberals are people who presumably have something to do with freedom. Presumably they love freedom. Conservatives are presumably people who want to conserve something, and we assume that they want to conserve something good. And populism has to do with whatever the concept will mean for us. We'll see, but definitely it has to do with people, since the word itself is the Latin equivalent of demos, and demos, of course, means the people, and so we can start from this meaning, from this simple meaning, and whether it's an ideology or a movement or a political style, we'll see, but it doesn't really matter from our political philosophical point of view. The only thing that we can already see from afar, that whatever this concept refers to, quantity certainly matters. So this is the starting point, the meaning itself, which is revealed by the word itself. And then from here, we can go on and say that populism is not new. It's not a modern phenomenon, whether it's a movement or an ideology. It's definitely not modern. It's as old as democracy. And democracy is, you can say that democracy was born together with populism. And you can also say that the first populist was Cleisthenes, who is famous for his reforms. He introduced at the end of the 6th century BCE, around 508, 507. And he's not the only populist in ancient times, but he seems to be the first one who simply decided to take advantage of his easier access to the people, to independent farmers living around Athens, in order to strengthen his own power and in order to further his ambition, his political ambition. So there were other populists in ancient times. In the Roman Republic, we can talk about the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, Gracchus, and also Publius Clodius. The first two lived in the 2nd century BC, and the second one in the 1st century. And they also made a name for themselves as the friends of the people, especially the Gracchi brothers introduced reforms which were very favorable for the people: land reforms, free grain, distribution of free grain to the people of Rome. These were certainly very popular measures. So neither populism nor populists are there's nothing new about the phenomenon itself. And we can see that whatever the concept is, it is definitely tied to democracy, and we can take a closer look what it means. Here we see the first populist who at the same time is considered to be the first Democrat. Now, one could say that populism is a democratic idea, but one can also say that democracy is a populist idea. Well, first of all, the term itself, the people, do not refer to everyone living in a certain region. We can tell that from the simple fact that demos itself, the Greek word demos, means one meaning of it is the people in general, but another meaning is in Greek the poor. So it also means the poor. Aristotle thought that the people refers to the poor, and democracy is really nothing but the rule or the power of the poor. And he also considered his definition of poor is people who do have to work for a living. So everybody who has to work for a living is considered poor. And so in this sense, you can say that democracy is really the rule of the poor over the rich. And you could also say that it is the rule of quantity over quality, or matter over mind, and this is what the ancient conception of democracy and populism would be. So, of course, it's a nice idea to say that that it should be the other way around, that mind should be over matter, quality should be over quantity. But unfortunately, quality is a subjective notion, and on the other hand, quantity can be measured objectively. And the same goes for mind over matter, which also sounds like a nice idea, but mind is also subjective. It only exists. One could say that it only exists as an idea in our brain. Modern science, of course, doesn't take seriously any talk about mind. Modern science only talks about the brain, because brain can be made an object of scientific observation and experimentation. But when it comes to talking about the mind, a scientist doesn't know what we are talking about. So this is the initial problem with the otherwise nicely sounding idea that mind should be over matter, or quality should be over quantity. So here's a visual illustration of reality meeting with the nice idea of mind over matter. Now, the argument for this nice idea that mind should be over matter, and an argument against populism, the practical, one might say, the practical refutation of populism is the Battle of Marathon, which is, as a battle, is quite insignificant because it wasn't really in the history of warfare. It's not counted as a significant clash of great armies. According to sources, the Persians could field about 30,000 people, and the Greeks about 10,000. So we are not talking about anything huge here. We are talking about something huge in a symbolic sense, because this victory of the Athenians over the Persians was symbolic in the sense that it was a victory of matter, of ideas, and of mind over matter, and quality over quantity. The Greeks were outnumbered about 3-1, as I said before. So the Greek general Miltiades was just a lot smarter than his opponent on the Persian side, and he employed a tactic which completely surprised the Persians and completely made irrelevant the fact that they were vastly superior in numbers, in quantity on the battlefield. So this victory can be considered as the triumph of the few over the many, and the triumph of quality over quantity. And one could say that this was the finest hour, the Greeks' finest hour, as Churchill would later on say about the British in the Second War. So, and of course meant pretty much the same thing. And one could also say that it served as an inspiration to the rest of Western history or Western thinking, an inspiration for non-material redemption, one might say. And there is a strand which runs through Western thinking of this non-material redemption, the idea that it is not quantity but quality that matters. Quality will save you, quality will redeem you, and this idea you can see in not only in Platonism but also cynicism. Cynicism meant, of course, in its ancient variety, which simply meant a lifestyle very close to nature, Stoicism and Christian asceticism. So the conclusion that we can draw from this is that here we have a practical refutation of the idea that quality is decisive in organizing a society, in redeeming a society, in redeeming an individual life. And Socrates gives us the theoretical refutation. So after the practical refutation that we can observe at the Battle of Marathon, and of course 10 years later in 480 at the Battle of Salamis, we have a theoretical refutation. And this theoretical refutation has a lot to do with the second great event, which I consider very important from our point of view in discussing populism and the origin of populism. This second great event is, of course, the trial of Socrates and the apology of Socrates, in which Plato tells us about this famous event. So in this apology, we can detect Socrates' attitude towards the idea of populism and towards the idea and the practice of democracy. And we can detect the argument for a non-material, or you might say elitist, concept of redemption. Here is what he says in the apology. This is how he exhorts his fellow Athenians. This is how he criticizes the way they organize their own lives, individual lives, after the Battle of Marathon. In other words, what he's telling them is that after successfully defeating the barbarians in the Battle of Marathon and at Salamis, they behave in their everyday life in this wonderful, glorious city of Athens. They themselves behave as barbarians, and this is how he puts it. Are you not ashamed that you give your attention to acquiring as much money as possible, and similarly with reputation and honor, and give no attention or thought to truth and understanding and the perfection of your soul? Arguably the most famous line in Plato's apology, in this speech that Socrates delivered at his trial, is that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, of course, this is an invitation to self-criticism. He's telling his fellow Athenians that they should look at their own lives critically. And as we know, the logic of criticism assumes that there is some standard. And the question is, what is the standard? And the standard is nothing else but the cosmic order. And this is what Socrates has in mind. while the starry skies in the visual expression of the cosmic order, but the conceptual background is the cosmos itself, which again is a name, is a word which reveals its own meaning, because the Greek word kosmeo means to beautify, to arrange in order, and it also just means order. And there is a very clear way to discover this order, and this way is through knowledge. And this knowledge was pursued at the first. We have evidence of this, very clear evidence, that the first organized pursuit of knowledge, which was aiming at finding out about this cosmic order, was Plato's Academy, and Plato's Academy had a curriculum, you might say, which was continuously kept up for about 1500 years. And so if you went to university in the medieval ages, you pretty much had the same subjects as Plato and his friends were interested in, and the subject that they were discussing in this academy. And these subjects were altogether were 7 of them, and they were together they were called the liberal arts. So these 7 subjects were divided into 2 groups. Trivia, the first 3 were called trivia, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and quadrivia, arithmetic, geometry, music theory, and astronomy. Now, the first 3, trivia and the first 3, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, obviously have a lot to do with human concerns, human communication, grammar, the rules and the structure of written communication, rhetoric, the structure of human speech and logic, the structure of human thinking. But the second one, the second group, quadrivia, and these 4 subjects had to do directly with what we were looking for, had to do directly with the cosmic order. So this is what supposedly gave you the standard by which you should measure your life, because once you get an insight into the essence of this subject, you are getting an insight into the very order of the cosmos. You might say that they all have to do with numbers. Arithmetic has to do with numbers in themselves, geometry with numbers in space, music theory it has to do with numbers in time, and finally astronomy deals with numbers in time and space. So this is considered these last 4 subjects, the quadrivia, supposedly gave you an insight into the order and harmony of the cosmos, and in that sense, to the good itself, because, of course, as the word itself says, cosmos is also a word which includes the quality of goodness. The cosmos is good in itself. It's beautiful as it is, and it's good as it is. And it's an intelligent hierarchical order. So Socrates has a chance to explain himself at the trial, and also has a chance to continue his theoretical refutation of populism or his criticism of democracy. Now, what happens at the trial is that he is accused of corrupting the young of the city. This, of course, means intellectual corruption, or he's accused of putting the wrong ideas into the head of these young people, undermining their beliefs, which they inherit from their parents, from the city, making them skeptical and making them curious of alternatives. So that's bad enough, and so he's charged of corrupting the young of the city. And in his discussion with his accuser, called Mellitus, who is a young poet, it's a quite funny discussion. They come to a point where Mellitus, who is taking himself very seriously, professes to be an expert of who corrupts the young in the city, and Socrates wants to know. I mean, he says, well, if you know who corrupts the young of the city, the young in the city, you must also know who improves them. And so he asks them, well, tell us, is there anybody else who corrupts them, or everybody else improves them? Is there anyone among the judges who corrupts them? And of course, his accusers will say, no, there isn't anyone. Is there anyone in the council? Now we are talking about 500 people, members of the council. No, there is no one in the council who corrupts them. Is there anyone in the assembly? Now we're talking about the entire citizen body. The assembly included everyone who had citizen rights. And Mellitus, his accuser, of course, replies that no, there is nobody in the assembly who corrupts the young. So it turns out that in this city, there is only one person who corrupts the young, and this person is a busybody, an elitist thinker, a philosopher. From our point of view, the interesting conclusion into which Socrates' accuser is actually cornered. The interesting conclusion is that, according to what Mellitus is telling us here, everyone understands politics except this philosopher, this busybody. Now, this is, of course, a very popular. People, the citizens of Athens, were obviously happy to hear this. And in a democracy, it is taken for granted that everybody understands politics. Now, the general assumption was in ancient times, and it's not a very unusual assumption, that every human activity which is worth its salt requires some special knowledge, and this special knowledge they call techne, which can be translated as craftsmanship or skill, but in any case, it's a special or specific type of knowledge. And so the assumption was that, and this is the populist, the quintessentially populist assumption, the assumption was that there is one exception to this rule. Every other human activity requires a technique if you want to produce some useful or beautiful thing, except politics. Politics does not require any special knowledge or any technique. So the conclusion is that we all understand politics, and it better be true, because this is why we give the vote to right to everyone, right? So continuing the debate between the elitist and the populist understanding of democracy or populism itself, on the one hand, we have a view of populist. We have a view of of techne, political techne, the democratic or populist view, which is that no such techne is required. There is no need for any special understanding or special knowledge. And opposing this view is the elitist or philosophical view, according to which politics is no exception, just like any other craftsmanship, just like any other useful and beautiful human activity or productive human activity. Politics too requires a specific type of knowledge, and it's very simple. There's a very clear definition of what the object of that knowledge is. The object of that knowledge is the difference between the good and the pleasant. So a politician has to be able to tell the difference between the good and the pleasant. And the philosophical view represented by Socrates is that most people, hoi in Greek, is not in possession of this technique, not in possession in the ability to tell the difference between the good and the pleasant, and this will have very far-reaching consequences. Now, of course, we all know, we are all experts when it comes to what is pleasant. A 6-month-old baby knows what is pleasant for her, right, or him. But when it comes to determining what is good for me or for anyone or for the community, that's a much more complicated question, and that does require deep understanding and knowledge, as opposed to having feelings about, having opinions about what is pleasant for us. We are so, if we just think about this for a moment, we don't have the simplest understanding in many cases of what is good when it comes to simply maintaining our body. This is why there is such a great proliferation of self-help books when it comes to diet books, advising you how to organize your diet. People have great anxieties about even that, which seems to be the most simple requirement for survival. So we seem to have lost our instinct for proper living, as opposed to, for instance, animals. So the question is still in the air. Is populism something which politicians make use of against the people, or is populism something which is a movement organized by the people? Now, the Socratic argument continues by saying that if we are unable to make a distinction between the pleasant and the good, then of course there's a great danger that we are going to mistake the two, or we are going to identify the two. And when one identifies the pleasant with the good, one ends up a hedonist. Hedone just means pleasure. And it is exactly this ignorance which prevents us from distinguishing the pleasant from the good, which gives room for the demagogues who will appear on the scene and will whisper very pleasant things into our ears and will convince us in the form of politicians. They will appear, these demagogues, and they will convince us to follow their lead, and it's usually not to anyone's advantage. A demagogue is somebody who will persuade us through sweet talking, and as you can see, the origin of this word. To persuade is a combination of two Latin words, and it just means to convince someone through sweet talking, because suade means sweet. So a demagogue is someone who literally leads the people, and of course he leads them by the nose. A demagogue is also a kleptomaniac, one might say, who deceives by stealing our mind, because the Greek word for deceiver is phrenoklepos, and this is a combination of phren, which is mind, and klepto, which is to steal. So as H.L. Mencken in the last century famously said, the demagogue is one who preaches doctrines he knows to be untrue to men who knows to be idiots. So here we are. A demagogue is somebody who is a person who gives himself to the people, and the people give them to him. Now, the problem with the ignorance, this ignorance about the distinction between the pleasant and the good, is that there will not be any standard for self-examination, because this standard can only be the good in itself, this cosmic good or the cosmic order. And if we lose sight of that standard, then we are indeed at the mercy of these kleptomaniacs. And in the absence of a clear standard, this is basically what Socrates is telling his fellow Athenians. In the absence of this standard, which is the harmony and order and rationality of the cosmos, it is very likely, there's a great danger that his fellow Athenians will live against the rationality and the harmony and the order of nature, which will result in an irrational and disharmonious and unnatural life. And Socrates, understandably, worries about a political system which is based on the leadership of people who cannot lead themselves. So a political community ruled by those who cannot rule themselves, or he is worried about an aggregate, and he considers that an aggregate of chaotic souls can only yield a chaotic society. This is how he explains why he never entered politics. This also tells us a lot about his criticism, his relationship to democracy. He says, no man on earth who conscientiously opposes either you or any other organized democracy and flatly prevents a great many wrongs and illegalities from taking place in the state to which he belongs can possibly escape with his life. And then he goes on to tell two stories from his life when he barely escaped with his life because he contradicted the illegal decisions of a democratic assembly. So this constitutes the practical and the theoretical refutation of populism and the criticism of democracy. And now we should take a look at the as opposed to the non-material elitist concept of redemption represented by Socrates, we should take a quick look at the material or populist concept of redemption as represented by all who are in favor of democracy. So the fundamental populist claim is that the many, the people, are morally superior to the few. And there are two arguments to support this claim. And the first one is very simple. It simply says that a collective is always smarter than a smaller group or a person. This is called the wisdom of the crowd. There's a book titled Wisdom of Crowds, in which the author argues that indeed, as empirical studies show, the crowd in the end always comes out a winner when it comes to decision making, because there is this somewhat mysterious emergent property. Somehow individual knowledge adds up to wisdom, which no single person could produce. So the objection to this argument is that, and it's also based on empirical studies, is that the crowd is typically good only at solving simple quantitative problems. So, for instance, at a country fair, it is true that the weight of an oxen could be estimated by a crowd. The average of when they added up all the individual estimates, it was much closer to the actual weight than any individual estimate. So this was considered to be a proof of the wisdom of the crowd. But of course, it is a reasonable objection to say that well, when it comes to quantity, it's no big surprise that a crowd of people can be fairly accurate. It doesn't require great intellectual effort. So the question that we should really answer at this point, what if Socrates is right in his criticism about his fellow Athenians? What if he's right about the fundamental irrationality of the many, as he calls them, of most people? So this is what we have to consider, and we have a very ready and very easy answer to this anxiety or to this worry. And this is nothing else but the Enlightenment answer. The Enlightenment answer is that, okay, this may be true, but this is not a fundamental psychological problem, but a technical problem. We just have to organize education in a way that we can enlighten those people whom we trusted with self-government. And so we are going to introduce universal and compulsory public education, and an educated public will make educated political decisions. So now, of course, once we decided on this, we can look back today and we can say we have about 200 years of this experiment, and the experiment doesn't seem to be going all that well, and it raises some skeptical doubts about the possibility of the success of such technical solution altogether. And Socrates, if we could put in his 2 cents today, would probably say, what if education in quantity or mass education is impossible as it is? Well, evidence seems to be showing that, of course, mass education is going on, or mass something. One might say mass training is going on in universities. And of course, the criticism formulated in this case relies on the standard that we talked about before, relies on the curriculum which was used for over 1,500 years with greater lesser interruptions. So are we allowing insight into the very nature or structure of the cosmos at universities? This is highly questionable. So one might say these are not really places of higher education, but places of training or training grounds where useful, relevant information are imparted to students about what is good in one or another specific field, but not about what is good in itself. So one might say that students today are trained to be technicians, but not virtuous human beings. And by virtues, the ancients meant, of course, excellent human beings, and by excellent they meant those who fulfill their human potential, and the special human potential, of course, is rationality. So, as Max Weber famously said about this type of new modern intellectual, these are intellectuals who are specialists without a spirit or vision, and voluptuaries without heart. So here we go. This is according to this would be Max Weber's judgment in visual expression. So the second argument advanced by the friends of populism or democracy is that the interest of the greater number should always be preferred to that of the few. Now, this is the utilitarian argument, and one might say that this is a concept of redemption through numbers. The utilitarian principle is very simple. We, as utilitarians, aim at the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers. So happiness is measured in quantifiable, countable amounts of material goods. And this very easily leads to what we might call political hedonism, where the good is, you remember that we said that identifying the good with the pleasant is hedonism, and identifying the political good with the political pleasant, we might call political hedonism. Now, this, of course, means institutionalized hedonism. And in politics, it comes into view in the shape of the politician who promises to deliver tangible, countable, measurable goods to maximize the number of votes received, because he simply starts from the assumption that there are no moral truths in politics. What counts is only that which is countable, and what is countable is votes. So the important conclusion that can be drawn from all this is that the technique required, and this is very important if you want to understand the position, if you want to understand populism applied to modern politics. So the conclusion is that the technique required in modern politics is not specific to politics. There is no. So politicians agree, modern politicians agree with Meletus that there is no need for special knowledge or understanding to do politics. The technique required in modern politics is not specific to politics. It is the technique used in marketing or accounting or PRing, but not any special. It is a technique which is already used in other fields and can be applied to politics, but there is nothing specific about this knowledge which would tie it to politics. So now another argument, and this is a very popular argument on the side of populism, and a very popular argument against elitism, against the philosophical interpretation of populism and democracy. And this is the Marxist argument. According to Marx, history is basically a long and depressing story of minorities, of quality, oppressing majorities, so quality is oppressing quantity, you might say. So this story will end only when a majority finally takes over. This is the exact quote from Marx's Communist Manifesto. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is a self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. So this, in the history of class struggle, this will be the only and first and only event where finally a majority will suppress a minority and eventually annihilate it. And this, of course, requires a complete reversal of history. It requires a revolution. This is the quantity revolting against quality. Now, but the Marxist argument on the side of populism is accompanied by, or the socialist argument is accompanied by another very popular position, which is the national populism, according to which history is a long and glorious story of our nation's great achievements and heroic deeds, all the way up to recent or not so recent times. Since then, it's the sad story of some internal minority or external majority oppressing, threatening the national majority. The two arguments supporting populism today, the two most popular arguments, you might say, are the socialist and the nationalist, or the socialist and the national version or variety of populism. And both varieties call for a complete reversal of recent history, and both varieties insist that the story will end only when a majority reasserts itself. In one case, it's a class majority. In another case, it's a national majority. So the characteristic of these two varieties of populism is that both of them have a very clear picture of redemption. The socialist variety insists that, or promises redemption in the name of a glorious future in which social justice will be finally done, while the nationalist variety promises redemption in the name of a glorious past, through the restoration of which historical justice will be done once and for all. But of course, one might reasonably object. The idea of this final social justice is no less of a fiction, even a chimera, than final historical justice. So the problem is that the objection that we raised, that there's something fundamentally wrong with social justice and historical justice, is that justice in its essence is neither social nor historical, but cosmic or natural. Justice means that all things and beings have their natural or just place and function in this world. And the defining common feature of socialist and nationalist populism is that they subordinate culture to their respective conceptions of justice. And I just have a few words to say about that because that's very crucial. So here we have an example, a visual expression of justice ruling over art, whether it's social justice or historical justice. The problem is that we cannot have a redeemed, harmonious society where culture is subordinated to anything. For culture is the cultivation of our natural techne necessary for being specifically human. It is the cultivation of our rationality. This is exactly what Socrates was telling us to begin with. And it's also important to emphasize that culture is a product of oppression. The order and harmony of society depends on the order and harmony in the souls of its constituting members. This is exactly what Socrates meant when he said that people who are unable to rule themselves will probably not be very good at ruling their own community. So the order and harmony of the soul is the result of this oppression, is the result of mind over matter, the rule of our specific human quality over a large quantity of desires we partly share with animals. And we can also add that in a harmonious soul, desires are organized in a hierarchical order, and only reason can do this job. Now, of course, the desire for food and sex are perfectly natural, and also the desire for pleasant living, comfortable, safe, and healthy living. We of course have to take these seriously, but these desires are to be cultivated only in view of and in subordination to the elite desires for truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, the anti-elitism of populism means is really a systematic erosion of our elite desires by a persistent pandering to our baser, less fully human desires. One might also say that a well-ordered society is a gourmet society and not a gourmand society. We know the difference between the two. A gourmet is one who looks out for quality. A gourmand is not so concerned about the quality of the food, but much more concerned about the quantity. So a well-ordered society is a gourmet and not a gourmand society. It oppresses a large quantity of desires, and what is more important even, it also oppresses the desire for quantity itself. And it does that for the sake of a specific human quality. And we all know that what this specific human quality is. It's our rationality which distinguishes us from every other animal. Now, populism might be compared to the fancy that Shakespeare talks about it in his Merchant of Venice. Populism, like fancy, is nourished by only superficially human desires and by equally superficial promises of their fulfillment. So you might say that the birth of a community of examined lives, the ideal community that Socrates was dreaming about or or hoping that by his exhorting his fellow Athenians, he might lead them to this ideal, to establish this ideal society. So the birth of this ideal community, of community of examined lives, of self-governed souls, is the death of populism, which at that moment, like fancy, dies in the cradle where it lies. Now, just one more word at the end. Political philosophy, as opposed to political science, would not venture to predict what the next decade, the decade that just started this year, would bring. We pretty much can agree it's a fairly accepted idea. It seems to be a consensus that the last decade was a decade of populism. It's very hard to tell whether it will continue, and the 20s will be also a decade of populism, or will be the roaring 20s as 100 years ago, as Niall Ferguson, the historian, said. It's hard to tell, even for a historian, it is hard to tell whether this coming decade will be a roaring 20s, the roaring 20s, or the rowing 20s. And by rowing 20s, he meant if the oceans will rise 10 feet, as they might, as part of this climate crisis, then of course we might 10 years from now remember the 20s as the roaring 20s, but only time will tell. Political philosophy will not venture in speculating about that. It will only venture to predict what I concluded with, that unless this ideal community comes to being, unless people will be able at one point to govern their own lives, democracy as self-government will always be a utopia.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture, Professor Salamon. Now it's time for questions, comments. So please do feel free to put questions or make comments. While we are waiting for the first question, let me raise the issue that Professor Salamon, in his wonderful lecture, he went very far in history as to ancient Greece, but didn't he go too far? As political science considers populism as a modern phenomenon and a modern concept or even ideology, how come, or how is it, to put it in simple ways, that political science and political philosophy are looking at the same thing so differently? So while we are waiting for your kind questions or comments, I will ask Professor Salamon to answer this question of mine.
Well, I make a distinction between political philosophy and political science on several grounds. One ground is that political science does not ask the fundamental question, the question central to political philosophy. And the question central to political philosophy is, what is the best political regime? Political science does not ask this question because political science considers that the question is already answered, and the answer is that the best political regime is democracy. So obviously, almost everything I told you about Socrates' criticism of populism and democracy is irrelevant from a political, scientific, or social, from the point of view of social science. Social science focuses on modern society and considers that society, modern society, can be redeemed, to use this word, only on a scientific basis, only by discovering scientific laws which are similar in their universality to the laws of natural science, of physics. So the model of political science is natural science, while the model of political philosophy is nature itself. Socrates, as I was telling you, criticized his fellow Athenians from this on this natural ground. He was talking about a standard which is a thoroughly natural standard, because this standard is logos itself. The Greek word for reason or rationality is logos, but it also means intelligent speech, so word. Logos also means word. So he was not a scientist, and certainly not a social scientist. He was a thinker who wanted to figure out the best possible human life for his fellow Athenians and for himself, and he was convinced that that life can be lived better than his fellow Athenians demonstrated in their own lifestyle. Society can be organized in a better way than the political system which condemned him to death was organized. I quoted you the sentence which demonstrates Socrates' criticism of democracy, or worries about democracy. So political science and political philosophy do not really compete in this sense. Political philosophy is concerned about everything which had been thought about the best life in the past 2,500 years, but political scientists do not consider it important, or they don't feel obliged to take such a long view. They really take the idea of natural science as a model seriously, and they think that they can discover universal laws which are valid in and which influence human societies by focusing on existing societies today.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a wonderful answer to this question. And now I see some more questions. I believe that Professor Salamon is not now reading the question and will answer to Martin's question. And I believe Eva Gede has a question as well. So the question of Martin is, dear Professor, thanks for your talk. I was struck by the fact that populism is, in your view, originally driven by elites. Would you go as far as saying that populism is, in a sense, an elitist project? What would you do then of authors claiming that populism is a leftist ideology aiming to revitalize democracy? Thanks beforehand for your response. So I'll ask Professor Salamon to answer this question.
Yes, well, I mentioned that political philosophy takes the long view, and when you take the long view and go back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, you cannot help but notice that democracy itself, let alone populism, but democracy itself as I mentioned at the beginning, seems to be a byproduct of competing aristocratic families. In the case of Greece, where democracy was born, after all, we have two competing families, two dominant families at the end of the 6th century BCE, and these are the Alcmenides and the Pisistratides, who compete for political power, political influence, and the usual way of this struggle for political survival, there were rules which were observed throughout. I mean, this was not anything new at the end of the 6th century. It went back centuries. It had a long tradition, this political infighting between aristocratic families. And so the rule was that everything was kept within the family, within the circle of these aristocratic clans or families. And Cleisthenes was the first one who broke this rule, and he turned directly to the people in order to gain support, because it was clear to him at that point that this sort of seesaw story will never end unless he brings into this fight some quantity. Quality is not enough, but he needed numbers. And certainly, as Aristotle tells us and the Bible tells us, the poor will always be the majority anywhere and everywhere in history. So in Athens too, the poor, the independent farmers and the poor people who had to work for a living, formed the majority, and they, of course, once this energy was channeled into politics, this could, of course, mean a significant advantage in this political struggle. And this is what Cleisthenes realized, and he was the first to use this energy. And as the result of this breaking the rule, as the result of this first ever relying on the poor in a political sense, resulted in his reforms, and his reforms resulted in what we call today democracy. But the same can be said about those populists that I mentioned in Republican Rome. These people, Claudius or Tiberius Gracchus or Gaius Gracchus, they came from patrician families or noble families. So they organized. If populism was a political faction or a political movement in Republican Rome, these were the organizers, people coming from the elite, from the aristocratic elite. But if we look to more modern history, there's a good argument that can be made, and a lot of people make it, although none of these are Marxists, I might say. There's a good argument that can be made that the French Revolution was not organized from below by oppressed peasants, but was prepared and organized in the aristocratic salons of Paris, and was organized by aristocrats and men of letters who took Rousseau's ideas very seriously. Robespierre was not a peasant by any means. He came from a very long line of lawyers. He was a lawyer himself. And you might say that he simply put Rousseau's ideas into a legal frame, or he applied his ideas to revolutionary lawmaking. Well, the same could be said about Lenin, who was not an ancient, big son of a great aristocratic family, but he came from a minor nobility, was not a peasant, was not a worker by any means. He was an intellectual. So historically, there isn't any real support for the idea, with the exception of a few peasant revolts. There is not much support for the idea that populism is organized by the people, that it's a movement, it's a grassroots movement. So the arguments supporting the democratic conception of populism, I quoted two, the socialist and the national, the socialist populist and the national populist idea, of course, will argue that the people are the initiators of any movement, and leaders only make themselves useful or available in these historic moments, but on closer examination, it just doesn't hold too much water. There's a good test of this, by the way. Marxists at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were hoping that this in fact will happen, that the proletariat will fulfill the role assigned to this class by Marx, that namely that the proletariat will be the first social class in history which comes to self-consciousness and will consciously organize itself to realize that historic mission that that was mentioned by Marx in that quote from the Communist Manifesto, to realize the mission of finally and the first time in the history oppressing, being a majority, not being oppressed anymore by a minority, as it always happened, it always had happened in the course of history, but for the first time, being a majority, oppressing a minority, and finally eliminating this minority, or absorbing it, and creating a classless society. So people were waiting for, in the same way as people were waiting for the second coming of Christ in the first and second century, but it just never happened. The proletariat just didn't seem to want to come to consciousness. And therefore, all sorts of new ideas had to be introduced by the Hungarian Marxist philosopher György Lukács, for example, who said, well, okay, we have to accept this fact that the proletariat just doesn't want to come to self-consciousness. So we are in dire need of a revolutionary avant-garde, of a revolutionary intellectual avant-garde movement, avant-garde in the sense that these will be the handful of intellectuals who will lead the revolution, and this is exactly what happened during the Russian Revolution.
Thank you for this answer. As Professor Salamon is now having a sip of water, maybe, just in case not everyone can read the questions, I read up another question. This is by Elżbieta. Since our project is all about migration, I wonder whether you could make some comments on the relationship between populism and the different waves of migration in ancient Greece. Furthermore, are there any lessons from the ancient times that are applicable to contemporary debates about populism and migration? So I ask Professor Salamon to answer this question.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, there are clear parallels between our present predicament and the ancient historical moment that I talked about, the Battle of Marathon and 490, and then the Battle of Salamis in 480. And the parallel is this. The Greeks were talking about being self-conscious of your historical role. The Greeks were very conscious of their historical role. We have documents to prove this. Probably the most famous document of showing how clearly self-conscious of their historical importance or their historical role the Greeks were, the Athenians were, is Pericles' funeral oration, which he delivered in 430 BC, which was an annual ritual. Every year they had a festive funeral celebrating the dead fallen in battles. So in this famous oration, Pericles gives evidence of the, if not self-importance, but the self-consciousness of the historical importance of the mission that the Athenians performed at the beginning of that century, of the 5th century. They were very proud of the fact that they were able to beat back the barbarians. The barbarians were everybody who came from the East, and the barbarians in this case were the Persians. The Persians were considered intellectually inferior, and that was clear from these two battles, where Themistocles in 480 in this naval battle and Miltiades in 490 at the Battle of Marathon outwitted their Persian counterparts, the Persian generals. It was a moral victory because it was supposed to be a victory of people who are defending their homelands. It was a political victory because it was a victory of democracy over Asiatic despotism. So they were very conscious of the importance of this victory. They were also conscious that this will go down in history. And I'm pretty sure that Pericles and his friends and many other Athenians were convinced that we, 2,500 years later, will remember them. And we do remember them for the reasons that I tried to outline at the beginning of my talk, because it is a symbol, it is considered even today a symbolic event, an event of enormous importance for several reasons. But one reason is that we shudder to think that if the Persians had won that battle at Marathon, how would Europe look today? So now the same concern seems to occupy, the same anxiety seems to occupy a lot of minds today. People are not so concerned about immigrants arriving from the West, from the United States or from Great Britain or Germany, but people are very concerned about migrants arriving from the East, just as the Greeks were very anxious 2,500 years ago, and were very, very pleased and very proud to prevent that happening. So now, what can political philosophy say about the situation that takes place today? What is the connection between populism and immigration or migration? Well, from what I was saying in this talk, I think one might put together an answer, and one answer would be is that if we are worried about the cultural collapse which seems to be inevitable as a result of a sudden influx of people from the East who represent a culture very, very different from ours, then perhaps this anxiety is unfounded. And it is unfounded because we, in the past 2 centuries, did a lot to undermine our own culture in a way which barely leaves anything to be destroyed. That's one view, of course. That's probably what Socrates would say today. He wouldn't be very pleased walking around in any Western city. He wouldn't be any more pleased with his fellow citizens if he were if he was a Londoner today, or a Parisian, or a New Yorker. I don't think he would be much more pleased with his fellow citizens. I don't think he would see them more occupied with perfecting their souls as the Athenians were occupied, or they actually were not. So and on an institutional level, I mentioned the universities for a good reason, because when I was talking about a recipe for a disharmonious and irrational society, I was saying that if a society subordinates culture to social justice or historical justice, it doesn't really matter whether the socialist populist or the nationalist populist will win the day, because they both are keen on subordinating culture to their conception of justice. And when that happens, culture will not really survive. And culture has to be taken in this very strict sense that I mentioned. Culture is really applying reason to nature. Culture is cultivating our natural potential, which is rationality. So one might say that an institution or a human being can be destroyed in 2 ways. One way to destroy an institution or human being is that it dies, right? The second way is that it ceases to be, that the institutions or human beings cease to be themselves. So this is, I think, what could be said about the connection between populism and migration, that a society preoccupied by extinguishing itself, by doing everything to achieve a situation where it simply ceases to be itself, doesn't really leave much to be destroyed for any external invasion. So this would be the most general answer I could give to the question: what is the connection between our modern predicament and the ancient one, and what is the connection between populism and migration?
Thank you very much for this answer. Let me remind you that we are planning to have a number of webinars in the course of next few weeks, and we will turn later on to more practical considerations and issues. We are lucky to have my colleague, Associate Professor Eva Gedő, with us in person. So I'll ask her to put her question by coming here and raise the question. So it comes the question by Eva Gedő.
Okay. So thank you for your interesting presentation. And my my question concerns your own theoretical presumptions. So, because if we deal with the phenomenon of populism, we need to face the very difficult and important problem of the relationship between the phenomenon of populism and the theories on populism. So my question is, can you tell us very briefly something about your own philosophical and theoretical presumptions, about your own theoretical position? Thank you.
Well, I hope to have outlined my theoretical position, but I can summarize it. My theoretical position of populism cannot be very different from my theoretical position of democracy on democracy. If it's true, as I tried to show at the beginning, that the two were born together as a historical fact, and they are logically related. Because both start from the assumption, populism and democracy start from the assumption that quantity matters. If you remember, I mentioned the example of the first populist, Cleisthenes, who was at the same time the first Democrat, who managed to hold on to power because of his discovery of how important quantity is, really. Quantity in a political sense, quantity which can be utilized in a political struggle. So if I start from the assumption that democracy is a byproduct of aristocratic political infighting, then, of course, my theoretical view on populism will not be very far from my theoretical view on democracy. And democracy is notoriously a thorny subject in political philosophy. The thorn in this case is Socrates himself, who was condemned to death, as I mentioned before, by a democratic society. So the relationship between philosophy and democracy in the past 2,500 years is a very tense relationship, one might say. Political philosophy, and this is one other major difference between political philosophy and political science. Political philosophy remains to be critical of democracy as opposed to political science, which, as I mentioned before, political science simply accepts the fact that democracy is the final answer to the question raised by political philosophy: what is the best political regime? So this is really my theoretical position on populism. The problems we face today, and this is the direct consequence of everything I said before. This conclusion is the direct consequence. So the conclusion is that the problems that we face today, the group of problems that we associate with populism, are really problems deriving from democracy, from our democratic habits, political habits, from our democratic institutions, from the success or failure of our democratic institutions, and of course, this can be expected if we accept the Socratic analysis that democracy is not really a rational. I mean, when he was criticizing his fellow Athenians, he was not criticizing them the way we are used to criticize our fellow citizens, that you don't lead a democratic enough life. He was criticizing them, one might say, by saying you lead a too much what you do is your life is too democratic. You shouldn't be so democratic in your life. You should make distinctions between the pleasant and the good. You should organize a hierarchy of your desires. In his description of democracy, in Book 8 of the Republic, Socrates talks at length about the democratic soul, the soul of the democratic person. And this soul is free in the sense that there is no order in that soul. There is no organization of his desires. There are necessary, as he calls them, necessary and unnecessary desires in a completely chaotic swirl in this soul. And basically, what happens in a democratic soul is these desires are fulfilled on a first-come, first basis. So if we start from these political philosophical assumptions, and if we take into consideration the criticism formulated by political philosophy directed against democracy, then we can pretty much draw our conclusions, and we can pretty much tell what our theoretical position will be on populism.
Thank you very much. And this ends up our first session of the webinar series, which was organized under the umbrella of Nova Migra Research, a webinar series on EU migration and refugee policy between populism and societal transformation. This event was organized by John Wesley Theological College in Budapest in collaboration with Objective Studio Budapest. Please don't forget that we'll have our next webinar next Wednesday on the 5th of February 2020 at 4:00 p.m. Central European Time. I hope it's convenient for all of you. Please join us then. So at the end of this program, let me thank Professor Salamon for this wonderful lecture. Let me thank you for your attention, for being with us, for joining us, and for these interesting and wonderful questions and remarks. Please join us again on the 5th of January at 4:00 p.m. next Wednesday. For now, from all of us here at the Budapest studio, it's goodbye.